So I'm Sunil, a software developer and founder of JavaScript in Plain English, a publication that you may have come across at some point on the internet. And in 2017, I worked as a junior developer for a digital agency in Nottingham. And we used to build a lot of sites and apps using PHP and Laravel, I know. And as part of working with them, I was introduced to Vue because it was kind of like baked into version 5.5 of Laravel at the time. So that was kind of like my first foray into front-end frameworks, libraries, and the like. And whilst building things with Vue, I, kind of like a lot of developers, I had a curiosity towards wondering what the things I was building might be like if I built them in React or any other whatever else is out there. So and initially I tried to find an article that covered this with some side-by-side code comparisons and explanations of those differences. But at the time I couldn't really find anything that explained it in a way that was approachable for me. So I decided to write the article myself. So at the time I built a simple to-do app in Vue and then kind of figured out how to build it again in React. Published the article and it received about 300,000 views in the first few days. Eventually ended up getting translated into 10 other languages. A year later, I followed it up with a 2019 edition that included some of the newer features that came in React at the time, so like React hooks and so on. And today I'm just going to go over some of those differences to help give you like a base level understanding of the differences between React and Vue. But I won't be covering things such as, why is React a library and Vue a framework or things like that, but rather what I would consider to be more practical differences. So let's start by just having a quick look at how our to-do apps look, which is that. So you've seen the UI, so we'll have a quick look at what a typical component looks like. So on the left, we've got React and you've got your imports at the top, and then you've got your component in the middle. You might have some inner functions in there, and it returns a bunch of markup or JSX, which kind of just looks like HTML. And then on the right-hand side, we've got Vue, which kind of splits it up into 3 sections. So at the top, we've got template, which includes your markup. In the middle, we've got the script section, which includes some kind of meta information about the component. And you may have some methods in there as well. And then at the bottom, we've got the style section, which just has your kind of general CSS and things like that. So moving on, how do we store and access data in React and Vue? So first, let's have a look at kind of what data we want our app to initialize with. So quite straightforward, we've got a list and to-do, and the list has an array of objects, and to-do is just an empty string. But how do we go about storing that data in a typical Vue or React component? So React on the left allows you to compose your data through a series of hooks. Vue on the right-hand side has a data function that returns an object with all of your data required for the component you are creating. I probably will just make a note to say that there are some changes coming to Vue that if anyone's already played around with the alpha, you'll know about it, and it kind of brings it a bit more in line with what we've got on the left. But because it's still in alpha stage, we're not going to cover that just yet, but there will be a revision to this eventually. Sorry about that. So just to kind of briefly go over how React hooks work for potentially anyone who hasn't used it. So we destructure the values from useState, which is one of the React hooks that allows us to kind of keep localized state in our components. So on the left, we've got list, and then we've got set list. So the first, or list, is what will actually hold the value that we want in our state. And the second, or set list, is what we'll use whenever we want to reassign the value of list. useState also accepts a parameter which we use if we want to initialize a list with a value. So kind of let's just go ahead and pass in our default list data, like so. And then we can do the same thing for to-do as well. So in our app, if we want to reference whatever the value of list or to-do is, we can just reference them like we would with any other variable in regular JavaScript. So if we want to refer to it inside of our markup, we can do so by just wrapping the value inside of curly braces like we can see at the bottom. In Vue, we would begin with our data function inside of the script section of our component. We can then begin to initialize it with data by adding our list and then adding our empty to-do string. And you'll see that they are key value pairs inside of that object. These values then become accessible on the components instance of this. So list becomes accessible by writing this.list, to-do becomes this.to-do, and so on. And as you can see from the example code in our create new to-do item, we reference this.to-do. So when referencing data inside of your markup or the template tags, Vue uses double curly braces or mustache tags to interpolate values created in the data object. And when using values from our data object in our markup, we can actually omit the use of the this keyword. So we can just write list or list.text as we have there rather than this.list.text. However, if you did write this.list.text, that would just still work as normal. So you might wonder what would happen if we tried to write this.list or this.to-do in our React app. In short, nothing would happen insofar that your app would just break because the values would be undefined. And the difference here is that in React, we're creating a variable and assigning it a value, and then using a function to recreate the variable whenever it needs a new value. So you might be wondering why we're having to reference our values off of an instance of this in Vue. And so in Vue, we execute a function called data that returns an object with values that we've passed in. Now, under the hood, Vue takes those values and creates a getter and setter for each key value pairing, and then places them on a components instance of this. So moving on, how do we mutate data? So let's say that we've got a variable that we want to create to store my name. So when I was born, I actually didn't have an official name for the first 2 weeks. And during that time, everyone just called me Sunny, a nickname which still stands. But then at around the 2-week mark, my brother mentioned the name Sunil to my parents, and that ended up becoming my name. So let's assign our variable with the value of Sunil. And then I remember a friend in primary school calling me Mowgli from Jungle Book, which I thought was kind of funny because Mowgli's like a kid who walked around in his pants in the jungle, and I definitely didn't do either of those. So anyway, let's say that we want to update the value so that the name is no longer equal to Sunil, but it's now Mowgli. So in React, it's likely that we would have created something along the lines of this. Now, if we want to update the value of name, we then use the setName function to update it. And the setName function takes a parameter which will be, whatever value we want to pass into our name variable. In Vue, we would have written something such as this, so that in our app, if we want to update the name in one of our functions, we can just write this.name equals Mowgli. Now, in Vue, this works, but in React, as I'm sure some of you will know, we can't just write name equals Mowgli, and this is because while the data would update, nothing notifies the UI that it needs to update. So calling the setName function informs React that it needs to resolve some changes, re-render the value in the UI. So why does updating this.name work in Vue? Well, you might mention, or recall me mentioning that Vue takes the values that were passed into the data function and creates a series of getters and setters for each. So these are closely tied together under the hood so that whenever a new value is passed to any of your values, i.e. you set a value, the UI is notified of this and re-renders. Okay, so how do we map data across multiple components? So in React, here we can write code that just looks very similar to regular JavaScript, and that's because it kind of more or less is. We take our list, which, if we remember, is an array of objects, and we can then use a regular JavaScript map function and return a to-do item component for each object in our list array. In Vue, we use Vue-specific syntax for looping over data. So if we take our to-do item component, and on the component, we can then write v4 equals item in list, as you can see on the top. This creates a loop which will then create a to-do item component for each object in our list array. So now that we've got multiple instances of to-do item components in our app, how do the child components access data that has been passed to them? So in React, you would pass data down from the parent component to the child by creating a prop on the child component and then passing the data as its value. So in our case, we've simply called the prop item and have passed in a value that happens to be the same name. Then in our to-do item component, we receive props as a parameter, which gives us access to the props that had been passed in earlier. In Vue, we pass props by writing :item equals item. Then in the child component, we would make a props key in our export default object. This typically receives an array as its value. We can then pass in the name of the prop as a string into the props array, which in this case was item. And finally, this gives us access to the item prop. So our child components can now receive data, but then how do they transmit things back to their parents? So we've got a delete item function for whenever the user wants to delete an item from the to-do list. We pass that function down to our to-do item component as a prop in the same way that we passed other values. Then inside of the component, we create an on-click event listener for our button that executes the delete item function whenever it gets clicked. So here we make use of the same function in Vue. However, you'll notice the use of the @ symbol for delete item inside of the to-do item component. This signifies an event listener in Vue. In our case, we've created a custom event listener called delete item. Then in to-do item.vue, we create an @click event listener, or like an on-click event listener. But here we use a Vue function called emit. And emit takes two parameters. The first is the name of the event listener, which we call delete item. The second is a payload, which in our case is the item's ID, or item.id. And in Vue, you might notice as well that for emit, there's a $sign before it, which is specific to Vue, and it's used to expose special instance properties that are available to use in your code. So it wouldn't be right if I spoke at London Web Perf without mentioning benchmarks and build sizes. So I ran some audits from inside Chrome's Inspector tab. So we used the Lighthouse audit on the React app with the following settings, which were the defaults. And then we ran it again on our Vue app with the same settings. And as you can see, our Vue app performed better than our React app by a fraction of a second in everything except max potential first input delay, which React performed better in. And then for those curious, max potential fit measures the worst case first input delay that your users might experience when they first interact with your app. So that's kind of things such as like clicking a button that might be on your app. And then these were the figures for bundled versions of our app when built with React and Vue's respective CLIs. So I removed, from the totals, I removed map files because they don't or at least shouldn't be getting served to your users anyway. I also removed images from there as well because those two figures could easily be reduced further with kind of standard image compression techniques. And here we do see a marked reduction in build size for Vue when compared with React. And there we have it. So a bit of a crash course in the differences between React and Vue as told from the perspective of building a simple to-do app. But where's Angular was a comment that I received a fair bit from the first edition of the article. So we fixed that by getting an Angular developer to write a part 2 to the article, and I'll put a link to that on Twitter and in the slides and so on. And then when I wrote the 2019 update, a few people asked me to do it again in Svelte, mainly on Reddit. So I did, and I'll link to that as well. And like I said before, there will be a 2020 edition of the article coming out once version 3 of Vue comes out of alpha, which hopefully should be soon. But if you are interested in kind of seeing how React and Vue continue to differ, you can usually find this body of work and everything that goes with it by just writing same app React Vue into Google, or kind of like whatever search engine tickles your fancy. And finally, I'd just like to take a moment to thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.